Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. Today, before I bore you with the circumstances of this case and a great deal of legal jargon, I would like to make you contemplate the topic of murder. Since the beginning of time, humans have condemned murder. Heck, even God has disdain for this action. May he bless our souls. And why do we look down on murderers? And on the same line of thought, murderers? It is because they are usually dangerous people. If a man just murdered his friend, what's preventing him from coming after you or your family? It is only natural to want to put these people in the big house, to rehabilitate these men and keep them away from our children. Such is the case for the defendant, George Milton. He is here to face the music for the murder of Lenny Small. George Milton was your quintessential farm worker, hardworking, quiet, and composed. Most importantly, he was a childhood friend of Lenny Small. The two were always as thick as thieves, accompanying each other from job to job for years. It should be noted that George was the dominant one in the relationship, with Lenny always at his beck and call. They were recently employed at a ranch around these parts. This all changed a few weeks ago, when Lenny got in an altercation with the wife of Curly, one of the co-workers, resulting in her death. Lenny went on the run, pursued by a mob of ranch workers armed with heaters. An hour later, George tracked Lenny down. Lenny was defenseless. That did not matter to George. After a brief conversation, which George told Lenny to look out into the distance, George shot him in the back of the neck. This was a clear case of first-degree murder. I would now like to call a few witnesses to testify against George. The following men have evidence to prove that George's action makes him dangerous enough to necessitate his imprisonment. My first witness will be Candy. Candy is an elderly swamper that works at the ranch that George and Lenny worked at. He has known George and Lenny since the day they moved in there, so he can provide some insight into George's true demeanor. Candy, introduce yourself.
Hello there, my name be Candy, and I've been working on the ranch for quite some time. I be an old man, and I've done always wanted to make a good living of myself. Ever since I met Lenny and George when they came about, I can always tell they had a different kind of friendship, and I remember them being real keen on the stream they planned on having together. They be wanting to own a ranch, pretty unique, and I even offered $350 to work with them and chip in. And Lenny was very keen about this dream, although George did act stiff around Lenny ever since I met them. He's always being a little harsh towards him, and George would tend to get mad at Lenny for some of those darn small mistakes. And I even remember when Lenny brought a little pup and George blew up on him for taking that thing from its mom. It was a very small thing, and George blew up, and I always wondered why. George claimed Lenny was too strong, apparently, and that's why he was so harsh, apparently. But he's always been making Lenny feel bad, and I didn't know why. I really didn't, and it always irked me because George and Lenny always depended on that dream, and George may be a man who could continue the dream himself. I mean, I always thought, what if, the madness, all of it, just drove George to do such a thing to Lenny? Because maybe killing the poor Curly's wife was just a mistake that Lenny made, and it was the final straw. I mean, what if it was just an action of madness and anger, and George has always been mad and blew Lenny left and right ever since they arrived at the ranch? Always getting mad at him for small things, and what if killing Lenny was intentional? Now George be a walking man, he could easily continue to buy a ranch. With his hatred towards Lenny, it was only a matter of time before Lenny did something to make George lose it. George was always looking out for Lenny, but a man can only take so much, am I right? That's all I can think, all I can say. Thank you for your...
I would now like to call up Crooks to the stand. Crooks is a stable buck at the ranch George worked at. He was especially close to Lenny, so Crooks could provide some reasons why Lenny could have compelled George to kill him.
Greetings, Your Honor. The name's Crooks. I'm currently working as a stable buck on the ranch that George and Lenny are staying at. When I first met Lenny a couple of days ago now, think about it, I ain't gonna lie, I was a bit skeptical. I mean, why would a white man want to do anything with a black cripple like me? Nobody ever gave a damn about me. I didn't mind it. If anything, I was used to it. It's my life. As I got to spend more time with this young fella, I began to realize that Mr. Smalls was nothing as I cut him out to be. He seemed friendly enough. Now, I am not the type of person to trust easily. I've had a rough life. But when Lenny started to talk about his future on a farm down yonder, I realized he's not like other fellas. Lenny has definitely struck a chord with George. George and Lenny were partners I've never had. I was so happy for them, but I have to admit, I did get a bit jealous. After speaking with Lenny for several hours, he started to open up to me, and he told me that George often snapped at him and threatened him if he forgot something. This alarmed me because Lenny obviously was not fully there in the head. I reckon he has some sort of mental disorder or something. It's just wrong for George to punish Lenny for something he has no control over. I do reckon that Lenny ruining their dream could have been the last straw and did result in George killing him. I believe this because it could have been a motive for George, and his dream meant so much to him. Lenny is such an innocent man, but I can see why he would have been a thorn in George's side. After Lenny killed Curly's wife, George did seem different. He was never the same. It was sort of like a switch was flipped. This could have been the point where George knew that Lenny must die. As you can see, Your Honor, George committed first-degree murder and should be pressed with the proper charges immediately. He is not safe to be around and is just endangering others. Thank you for your time.
The next witness will be Carlson, a roommate of George and Lenny. He is here today to testify against George because of the fact that George stole his Luger to kill Lenny. Mr. Carlson, please introduce yourself and give us the rundown of the situation.
Good afternoon. My name is Carlson and I work as a laborer at the ranch George and Lenny also work at. I met George a few days after he started working at the ranch and he seemed like a nice fella. I was informed about George's sentencing and I fully support the prosecution's charges. George committed a major crime and should be punished accordingly. George had no damn right to steal my Luger. He used my gun, my precious Luger, to commit a crime. My Luger! George should not be able to take a gun and shoot someone whenever he sees fit. Lenny was George's best friend. They went everywhere together. And George being able to shoot Lenny just like that is cold-hearted and disturbing. Imagine what he can do to a complete stranger, let alone his friend. Despite how much George cared for Lenny, he still raised a gun to his head and killed his brotherly companion. No matter the circumstance, a crime is still a crime, and George committed first-degree murder and should be locked away for the safety of those around him.
As my last witness, I would like to call up the owner of the ranch that George worked at. He has suspicions about George and Lenny's relationship since the day he hired them, so he's here now to inform us about them. Please come up to the stage, Mr. Boss. Okay, Boss. What is your name? I digress.
Nelson and Lenny Smalls, work boss. Upon arrival at the ranch, the first thing I noticed about the two of them is Good afternoon. I am George Milton and Lenny Smalls, work boss. Upon arrival. Good afternoon. I am George Milton and Lenny Smalls, work boss. Upon arrival at the ranch, the first thing I noticed about the two of them is that Lenny would do whatever George said, no matter what. Most of Lenny's decisions relied heavily on George's influence. An example of this would be during the job interview when Lenny was confronted. He looks instantly at George as he didn't know what to say. George instantly backs up Lenny by praising his strength and work ethic. This is where I begin to suspect that George is exploiting Lenny because of how clueless Lenny is. It is also obvious that Lenny relied and trusted George a whole lot and relied on him. I believe that George was manipulating Lenny. Not many people travel around together, you know? Especially since George and Lenny are the kind of people that move around for work. Not many of them do it together, especially when jobs are so hard to find. George may have figured out that Lenny wasn't the smartest and tried to benefit off of the big guy. Anyways, Lenny killing someone threatened their jobs, and George probably figured that out, so he killed Lenny. It isn't unreasonable to think that George used Lenny till Lenny wasn't useful to him anymore.
That would be all, boss. So there you have it, folks. These four men have attested to the fact that George might be a danger to society. Yes, he was reported to have been caring for Lenny, but as we have heard countless times, George often had moments where he would lose his temper and hurt Lenny. Lenny ruining both their job prospect and their dream could have easily been the spark in the powder keg for George. It's crystal clear that George's true intentions were to harm Lenny. Even if George wanted to kill Lenny to punish him for the death of Curly's wife, it is still extremely worrying that he took the law into his own hands. It would have been more fit for the court to handle that matter. Like Kara was separated, and is scared to think that men like George could kill you with your own weapon on a whim. We cannot have a criminal like George on the loose, ready to murder whomever he sees fit. Therefore, I propose that he should be punished to the full extent of the law. I rest my case.
The Prosecution of George Milton by Shayla, Andrew, Ihong, Simran, and Sonia.
What will George's sentencing be? George Milton will be sentenced to 40 years in prison for the murder of Lenny Small.
George should be imprisoned also because he took advantage of Lenny's trust and killed him. Lenny completely put his faith on George and trusted him with his life. He wanted to have a future with him. George also took away a citizen's right to a free and fair trial. A man as dangerous as George needs to be imprisoned because he could harm others and himself.
The effects of imprisonment includes keeping the public safe. This means while George is in prison, he cannot hurt anyone. Rehabilitation, George will learn not to commit murder. Deterrence, George and the others will be deterred from harming others at the risk of a prison term. It enforces justice. Anyone who commits first-degree murder without a justifiable reason should always be imprisoned.
Okay, so what lessons were learned? Well, 2 goals of the legal system were reached. 1, resolving conflicts between citizens. By imprisoning George, it prevents him from coming into conflict with any of his other co-workers. And 2, by promoting order and stability in society. Now, this helps George be discouraged and prevent him from causing chaos within the society by killing his peers. Now, we now understand this beneath what is seemingly a caring relationship like George and Lenny. There could be an intense hatred for each other. This hatred can lead to fights and at worst can lead to death.